Hi there, my name's John and I am Human Doing. And what am I doing today? I'm building a ferret habitat in my daughter's room for Drax and Mosey, her new ferrets. And here's how I did it.
And not to give it all away, but this is the finished product, so you can see the ferret wheel, little storage cabinet, and the ferret house itself. And the beginning of this project, like so many others, is to tear down your sheet goods. You can see I'm making this entirely, well, almost entirely anyway, out of MDF. So I'm tearing those sheets down into smaller, more manageable pieces with my table saw, but anything that's a little bit too big for the table saw, because I'm limited in space, I use my track saw. So first thing you're going to do is tear down your sheets. Anytime you're taking MDF or any other sheet good down, cut your biggest pieces first, because if you do make a mistake, not that I would make one, but if you do make a mistake, you can reuse that piece for something smaller. So always start with your biggest pieces. So once you've got your sheet goods broken down into, I'll say, more manageable pieces, you can begin to cut your small parts. I always like to leave at least one big piece, whatever the biggest piece is. If I can double it, I will. But then I can take those big pieces and trim them down into smaller pieces. Again, if you did make an error with one of the big ones, you can always use that piece for something smaller. So it's just, that's how generally I take my sheets down. Now, beyond just cutting your big parts first, it's always a good idea, I find anyway, for sheet goods to do similar cuts or same cuts. Use that one setup for as many pieces as you can. So in this case, the pieces, say 60 inches long, 15 inches high. I cut all my pieces that are 60 inches long at one time, and I do all my cuts at 15 inches. I do that at the same time. And then the depth on this one is 14 inches, so if I do the depth, I try to do that all at one time. Then we have the fewest number of setups. So once all my sheet goods are cut down, I can begin on some of the details. So you can see these circles I'm cutting here. They're actually for storage for my daughter's sort of stuffed animals. We call them stuffies. And the smaller hole on the front of this cabinet is actually sort of a viewing hole or a peephole, whatever you want to call it, for the ferrets. So I put PVC in there. That's weeping tile for normally for drainage for the outside of your house. But in this case, we're using it as a tunneling system. So you can see the small hole in the center there. And that connects the two sides. So that's the ferret wheel and their house itself. So there's one of the guys right there. They're just having a good time saying hello. And they like to peek through once in a while. And then they will scurry over to one side or the other. So you can see they can pop in right through, no problem. And it gives them something to do during the day instead of just, waiting for the kids to come home. Now, there's no fancy joinery required in this particular project. So I'm just using a dado setup here. And so what I'm doing is I set the dado stack up so that it's 5/8 wide, because this material is 5/8 thick. So it's nice and flush on the end. But I'm also setting the depth up at 5/16 or half of 5/8, so that when two pieces come together, it's exactly half when it fits like that. So nice, clean joint. Dado stack, easy to set up, and it just makes assembly. The reason I primarily do this one, it's a stronger joint than just a butt joint, but it's also much easier for assembly because the project will come together almost like Lego. So everything just sort of fits the way it's supposed to, and you don't have to worry about square or anything like that, because as soon as the dado is cut, assuming your table saws are set up square, which check before you cut it, but once it's set up, you really don't have much to do other than making sure you push it together, nail it, and you're done. So I am using nails, but I am also using, you can see here in the video, I'm using carpenter's glue. Nothing fancy, you don't have to use anything special, just standard everyday carpenter's glue. It'll do just as well. The dados are going to help hold it together. The nails really only hold the project together long enough for the glue to dry, so the glue does the bulk of the work, but the dados will help a little bit with strength. But one thing I did make an error on, and that was I didn't cut a relief spot or a relief cutout or hole into the cabinet to allow the track or the tube to run in from one end to the other. So I did it with a jigsaw. I could have made it fancy. I could have done something with a router, but I decided, you know what, it was sort of the end of the day, and I'm like, you know what, I'm just going to cut it with a jigsaw. You can see here the plastic T, and it goes from one end of the cabinet where their little house is, and it goes all the way to the other end, which is where the ferret wheel is. Now, because the piping I used is weeping tile, it has holes in it, which should help with any breathability concerns. Instead, as you can see, this piece here I'm doing, instead of doing a face frame, so multiple pieces assembled into the shape that I'm looking for, these holes that I'm cutting here are actually for the windows, the plexiglass windows. And instead of doing a full face frame, I just made them into one piece and cut the holes out. I'm doing that using a router bit. It's a spiral router bit with a collar attached to it. And doing it this way, I find it's just, it will take me less time to manufacture it. So these pieces of plywood I'm using, they're just scrap, and they're used to guide the collar. If you're not sure what the collar is, you can see here, that metal, there's the bit popping out through, that's a spiral router bit. And so that collar follows along that piece of plywood. Versus, say, a router bit with a bearing, which you can see here. So the bearing would be the guide in this case. And this, I am using it, and that's for the inside, and that's to do a relief cut to allow for the plexiglass to sit a little, somewhat more flush. So I'm making this cut here, and that's again to allow for the plexiglass to sit inside the cabinet. And again, from the outside, when you're looking at it, when it's done, you don't see this relief cut. All you'll see is the plexi and a slight round over that I've put in there for you. The piece you see me cutting here, this is actually the top of the habitat, I guess, the house or the cage for the ferrets. And the relief cut I'm doing here, it's exactly the same as the previous. The only difference is, instead of plexi, I'll be putting in a metal mesh. So it's a 1/2 inch square metal mesh, which is easy to find at all your local hardware stores. So here's some of the assembly for the sort of the enclosure or the cage for the ferrets. So again, it's very similar to the stuffy cabinet or the stuffed animal cabinet, and that with those relief cuts, those dado cuts, it goes together extremely simply. It goes together just like I said before, like Lego blocks. So you can't really mess it up as long as you make sure your joints are pushed in tight. And again, it's held in with glue and nails, and that's it. You give it maybe half an hour to dry, and you're ready to go. So I'm not going to show the entire cabinet assembly because it gets repetitive, but you can see the final product right here. And it's actually got a 1-coat of primer. You can see there's shelves in there for the ferrets. But the fun part for me is starting right now. This is the Ferret Wheel, we're calling it, the Ferret Wheel. So that is about 3 foot in diameter, and it's sort of like a running wheel like you would for a hamster or something else. But so I'm cutting 2 big diameter pieces like this. This is actually the outside of the Ferret Wheel, and I'm cutting a relief in it right now using that same wing cutter, or the same cutter I used before, and that's the same thickness as the MDF itself. So that's a 5/8 thick depth of cut. And I'm going to do that on both sides. The only thing I'm not doing on the opposite side is that really big hole. So this really big hole, that's going to be the doorway. There'll be plexiglass on it just to allow the ferrets to come in and out. The other side will be the back side. It will have a hole in it as well. So I cut that relief, and then what I need to do is kerf MDF. So a kerf, if you're not familiar, that's the material that the blade takes away. That's a kerf, and you can see how flexible it gets. So all I'm doing is, it's a 1/4 inch wide blade, and I'm leaving a 1/4 inch of MDF. So when you do that and you cut almost all the way through, like less than a 1/16 of an inch is left of the material when you're doing the cut. And if you do that correctly, you end up with a very flexible, also very fragile piece of MDF. But if you're careful with it, you end up getting a really nice smooth finish on the outside. But you can also get a really flexible piece of material, which for something like this, which is a circle, it's ideal. Now, I was supposed to do this in 2 pieces. One piece would have been too long, and I think it would have broken because the material is fairly flexible, fairly brittle. So I end up supposed to do this in 2 pieces, but they say measure, twice, cut once. I say measure once correctly, and you don't have to worry about it, but I didn't do that. So I end up, you can see that little extra piece there, that little 2.5 inch piece. So that's because I didn't cut, or I didn't measure. Well, I guess I didn't measure or cut correctly, so that's what you get when you don't do it. But, so this piece here is just going in together, and that's the big opening. And again, it's just held together with nails. I did use a little bit of extra help holding this together, and I did let it dry a little longer. So I used the help. I did the Canadian help kind of way. I used duct tape, because duct tape's on everything. So I used that just as a little security blanket for myself to make sure that this dried correctly, and I gave it a little extra time. I gave it about 24 hours. And once I was confident that that glue was dry, I just filled all the little gaps in with some basic filler and sanded it all down. You can see that hole that my hand is inside there. That is for the bearing, which you can see here. I just got it on Amazon. It's not designed for this. It's actually just for a serving tray bearing, so you can, pass the cheese. But I just took that and I cut some holes in it to make sure I had room for screws. I just wanted that big opening on the inside. I needed a bearing that allowed me to do that, because I wanted the access hole to be as low as I can, or as low as it could be. And you can see here, this is my first time spinning it, and I'm, giving you the thumbs up, so I'm happy. So now that I'm ready for finishing, because all the cabinetry portion, the manufacturing at least part is done, so I'm using the same lacquer that I've used, I think, in all my other YouTube projects, for the most part anyway, and most of the cabinetry in our house, which is, it's a white pigmented lacquer. So it's just white lacquer, like you would, again, for our kitchen cabinetry, all of our other cabinetry is this color. I'm going to use walnut as well as an accent. So it looks good and it matches everything else in our house. But the inside of the ferret wheel, I wanted to do something that would be sort of good for the ferrets. So to cover all those kerfs, again, it's aesthetic as well, I suppose, but I wanted something that they could grip onto. So I'm putting carpet in, and it's just with contact cement, but the contact cement will hold really well. I mean, it's really good for carpet. So this should last the lifetime of the entire cabinet. But even if it didn't, it's easy enough to pull away and redo if for some reason it got destroyed. So once it's all in, there's really only one joint. I could have made the joint, a little cleaner, but in this case, I was more than happy with the way this turned out. And the ferrets, they really, really enjoy it. They don't go as fast as, say, a hamster, but they really enjoy it. Now, access to that ferret wheel, I wanted to put a flexible tube because it makes it easier to assemble and disassemble when needed. So I put a flexible tube that connects into that main tube that you saw earlier. But we also wanted to have access, or to see them when they were in it. So that's the reason there's the big hole. So in this fairly grainy video, sorry about that, you can see that I'm putting in sort of a piece of plexi, but instead of using screws, I just use caulking, just silicone caulking. And a little air hole with the mesh, just to make sure they can't get out, is in the center. But you can see this is Drax. He's just going for a walk. And they like to go for walks in this thing, and there's a door. I just use sort of acrylic hinges. Again, I got those on Amazon, with a little door. Now, I should also comment, because I wasn't sure I was going to put in the mesh, but I ended up just using liquid nails. So I just pushed the mesh in, liquid nails, gave it 24 hours to dry, and that was all it needed. And again, here is the final project. It turned out well.
All right, so that's how I made the ferret habitat for these two guys. I hope you liked it, and please like, subscribe, put any comments you have down below, and I will answer them as soon as I can. Thanks for watching.